I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Inez Stepman.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Amber Duke.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. All right, today we got plenty of interesting topics. Ben is going to kick us off with looking at how the Democrats' Arctic frost investigation against United States senators was just exposed. Amber is going to talk about how Virginia Attorney General Democratic candidate Jay Jones is texting about how he wants to murder the children of his political opponents, which is pretty bizarre and awful. I'm going to be talking about the events in Portland and Chicago and the attempt to call up the National Guard to deal with Antifa. And finally, Inez is going to talk about Trump's New Deal for the universities. So with that, we'll kick it over to Ben.
Thanks, Will. And yeah, we continue to get this drip of disclosures regarding, or essentially investigating, the purported investigators post the 2020 election, and then also even, of course, going into the first Trump presidency and immediately thereafter Inauguration Day. This disclosure from Chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Chuck Grassley, has been doing yeoman's work with whistleblowers, trying to find out about the nature of the size, scope, and the extent of the weaponization of the FBI and DOJ, was staggering. And every disclosure is staggering, and we almost get desensitized to them at this point. But what he found was that the Arctic frost so-called investigation, which was initiated by, among others, an FBI agent who's a known Trump hater, who's sort of a Forrest Gump of many of these investigations, Timothy Thibault, basically, as part of their investigation, which morphed into the Jack Smith January 6 probe and case, they looked at the communications, the phone records of 8 representatives, I believe it's 7 senators and 1 member of the House, their communications from January 4th, 2021 to January 7th, 2021. And these are phone records regarding who the senators and 1 member of the House, I believe, were speaking with. Some of them, by the way, members of the Judiciary Committee, the very committee that was probing these activities. They looked into who they spoke to, for how long, et cetera. And what this amounts to essentially is the FBI surveilling the communications of the legislative branch. And this is not the first time, by the way, that we've seen this. I think I covered before that there were these secret gag orders put out where you actually had the FBI looking into the communications of staffers, for example, on the intelligence committees in the House and Senate. And the people whose records were subpoenaed, they didn't even know for years, because there were these non-disclosure orders that were put in year after year. And in many cases, the people who didn't know they were having their contacts surveilled by the FBI were the very ones who were investigating Russiagate, for example. So we've seen this a lot now. It's staggering, obviously, when you look at the names of the senators. We're talking about the likes of Lindsey Graham, Bill Hagerty, Josh Hawley, Dan Sullivan, Tommy Tuberville, Ron Johnson, who, of course, Johnson and Grassley were both targeted and sought to be tarnished, essentially, by the deep state as they were investigating a lot of the corruption that was taking place, as well as Cynthia Lummis, Marsha Blackburn, and Mike Kelly. To me, this would be a massive scandal that would suck up all the oxygen in the room in normal times. That it hasn't, I think, yes, of course, illustrates the insanity of the news cycle generally, but I also think shows that we have become, to some extent, desensitized to this. And of course, this obviously authoritarian kind of action where essentially, when you step back, they were criminalizing or alleging that it was criminal to challenge an election and then snooping on everyone and their mother who might have had any nexus to the election challenge, as well as we found out the Arctic frost subpoenas of 90 plus individuals and groups, ranging from the likes of Jeff Clark, who we've talked about before, to Turning Point USA as an organization. This was an effort to criminalize and chill the conduct of the conservative movement, essentially. And then, of course, to launch a domestic counterterrorism campaign, so-called, to really put the screws to anyone and everyone who dared to challenge our ruling regime. And now that very ruling regime claims that norms are being shattered and that the Trump administration is violating all sorts and slaying all sorts of sacred cows, when, of course, there's an attempt to hold anyone and everyone to account who was responsible for inflicting these terrible attacks on our republic. So remarkable to witness in real time. I assume that this is just the tip of the iceberg, that we now know that they were collecting records on these communications of senators from January 4th to 7th, 2021. Curious what you all make of both the findings here, the revelations here, and then, of course, the response from regime media and others.
I agree with you that this is not just a stunning development, but the lack of reaction to it really tells us just how far in, like, we've crossed the Rubicon so many times that people are almost not even surprised anymore when they hear about the extent of the politicization of justice under the Biden administration, whether it was spying on Republicans or conservative Catholics or pro-life activists, trying to throw them in jail. Naturally, going back to the Obama administration with Crossfire Hurricane and the very spurious origins of the Russian collusion narrative, the raid on Mar-a-Lago and all of the lawsuits against Trump. It's just absolutely mind-boggling the extent to which this was done. And I was talking about this with my co-host on Rising this morning, and her reaction was basically like, well, so what? Like, the senators might have been doing something wrong. Like, what are you talking about? For one, like, that's totally insane. Like, the idea that like Cynthia Lummis was what, like, orchestrating January 6th, it's just so inane and like completely divorced from reality that people are trying to justify this. But we saw the same thing happen from Obama to Trump. Like, people were bellyaching about Trump's treatment of the media because he said things that were not nice about them when Obama literally spied on journalists. It's just unending hypocrisy and absurdity from the left with how they weaponize the government against their political opponents. And it does feel like no matter how much we point it out or elevate these stories, nothing really changes.
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely with what Ben said, that I think this is actually kind of on us, on the right. I think the gatekeeping media has so much less power than it used to. It's because we're blasé, and we've you know, especially on this podcast, I feel like there was an entire year there where every single time was like, well, the Rubicon's been crossed again every week. Here's today's traffic, right? And I think we need to come back with the appropriate amount of shock. This comes on the heels of a similar information coming out of this investigation that showed that multiple members of Congress also were spied on using the Marshall Program, meaning the program on airplanes that is meant to prevent bum rushing the cockpit by terrorists. The government instructed those law enforcement officials to sit behind their political opponents and try to see what they were saying on their phones and who they were talking to. Okay, and in answer to your co-host, Amber, even if the senators were doing something wrong, that's what domestic criminal enforcement is for. You know what you need for that? You need a warrant. You got to go to a court and get a warrant if you think that somebody is breaking the law, if there's that somebody is an American citizen, let alone your political opponent and a senator. You don't get to use the apparatus of the federal government that is meant to spy on terrorists and foreigners to try to basically surveil your political opposition because you think they might be up to something. This is Stasi level stuff. Everybody involved in this should be in jail, frankly. And it really adds just an additional ridiculous little point to the norm breaking talk about, for example, prosecuting James Comey for lying to Congress. This is only norms breaking if you just woke up from a coma in the last 15 years. It is truly shocking. We're only finding out some of the most egregious stuff now. We will probably continue to find out some of this. I mean, there needs to be some kind of collation into some kind of truth and reconciliation report, and there needs to be prosecutions because this stuff, it's unbelievable that it happened in this country, and it would still be happening right now if we hadn't basically won an election. We can't assume that we have to assume that it would go right back to happening if we lose one. That's not the kind of politics that America had even for 250 years of this country until very, very recently. We did not have this kind of Rubicon trafficking, banana republic politics. But That's where we are now. And the best path forward is to expose it, to publicize it, and to prosecute people who broke the law in abusing their power against American citizens and against their domestic political opponents, because it's not something we should just, sort of forget and tolerate.
Yeah. The really remarkable thing, I mean, there's many remarkable things about this. The fact that you have one branch of government spying on another without any real basis for doing so. We have all these people complaining about Trump weaponizing the government, obviously in the aftermath of the Comey indictment and the talk of indicting Letitia James and Adam Schiff for mortgage fraud. And yet, just when everybody's getting in an uproar on the Democratic left about how dare you weaponize the justice system, we have yet another example of them weaponizing politicized investigations in order to go into senators' phones without any basis in reality. And of course, now they're poo-pooing that, like, oh, well, maybe they did something wrong. It's like, well, yeah, obviously. It seems like your logic on the Democratic side is anytime that, there's an allegation against a Republican, it's probably true. And anytime there's an allegation against a Democrat, it's completely frivolous. It's like, okay, great. Yeah, that's a really sound way to run the country. It's really going to work going forward. These people aren't serious. This is a massive abuse, and hopefully it gets fixed. And with that, we can kick it over to Amber.
Yes, another really disgusting scandal from the left. Another instance of left-wing individuals glorifying and endorsing political violence. This one from Jay Jones, who is the Democrat running for Attorney General in Virginia, where I live, Joy. He's running against incumbent Republican Jason Miyares. The race is actually much closer than the gubernatorial race. Some polls had it tied. Some had Miyares within 4 points of Jay Jones. But the race has been roiled by this latest set of scandals. So I'll start with the most egregious one, which is that in 2022, Jay Jones, who was a previous member of the House of Delegates, left before his term is up, which some people have been putting question marks next to. Why did he leave his term early? But he decided to text somebody about wanting to kill the speaker, the Republican speaker of the House of Delegates, Todd Gilbert. He apparently sent this text message to the wrong person. He accidentally sent it to Republican Carrie Coyne, who is still serving in the House of Delegates. And she quickly pushed back on him and was like, well, first of all, I think you sent this to the wrong person, but also, why are you talking about committing violence against Republicans, your political opponents? Like, this is totally off the reservation. And instead of apologizing or letting go, Jay Jones actually doubles and triples down, telling her in a series of texts that if he had a gun with 2 bullets and Todd Gilbert was next to Pol Pot and Hitler, he would put 2 bullets in Todd Gilbert's head every single time. He then called Carrie Coyne to further explain his position, which included that he thought Todd Gilbert's children should die in their mother's arms because it might change his politics on gun control. Carrie Coyne has since said that in a 2020 conversation, Jay Jones also expressed to her that he believed police officers should die when encountering violent suspects, because it might lead to fewer instances of police brutality. So this is someone who, on multiple occasions, actively wished death upon his political opponents, viewed political violence as a tool to get people to change their political positions, and when called out on it and told how inappropriate it was, he actually defended himself and doubled and tripled down. This is in addition to another scandal, which was the first one to come out, in which he was arrested for reckless driving. Also in 2022, he was going, I believe, 46 miles per hour over the speed limit, going 116 in the 70-mile-per-hour zone, and was able to cut a deal with the judge where he got off with community service and a fine. But in doing his community service, he did 500 hours of it with his own political action committee, Meet Our Moment, which is prohibited under Virginia law. The community service cannot be with a political organization. We confirmed that with the prosecutor in New Kent County yesterday. And then the other 500 hours he did with the Virginia NAACP, who he later partnered with on a lawsuit against the Youngkin administration, which he is now campaigning on to run against Jason Miyares. So basically, this guy is caught driving 46 miles per hour over the speed limit and uses his punishment to actually advance his own political career, which his political career involves, again, glorifying political violence. these text messages, of course, come at a time when we have seen numerous high-profile instances of the left committing political violence, using the exact same rhetoric that Democratic leadership has been using against Republicans repeatedly. The attacks on ICE, the Charlie Kirk assassination. There was a person arrested in DC over the weekend who had 200 handmade explosives in a tent outside of a Catholic church where they were holding a red mass for SCOTUS justices. He expressed anti-SCOTUS sentiments and anti-ICE sentiments. No one's really talking about that story, but just the latest example of left-wing violence. Now, the response is equally disturbing because Democrats in Virginia condemned Jay Jones, quote unquote, but not a single one has called for him to drop out of the race. In fact, they have been praising his character and his values in their statements, explaining why they think people should still vote for him. I'm just unbelievably disgusted by this. This is a guy running to be the top cop in Virginia. And if you're a Republican in Virginia, a conservative in Virginia, that should terrify you. I don't know what else to say about it because it's honestly renders me speechless sometimes to think about this guy just getting away with this. But I'll kick it out to the group.
Getting away with it is exactly why we're here. I mean, that
Yes.
Kavanaugh assassin got a slap on the wrist relative to his attempt to actually murder. Sorry, somebody at my door. Murder a Supreme Court justice because of political motivations, right? Before that, I don't know if people remember the two lawyers who firebombed a cop car. They got basically a slap on the wrist during 2020, right? And along with all of the violent rioters who did not see any kind of justice for all of the property damage and actual loss of life that occurred during those riots. And this is not recent, right? If you go back to Asada Shakur, who's being lionized all over the New York Times this week and the media landscape, right? And the thing she actually got put away for where she actually had to escape prison and go to Cuba, right? That was her third violent offense. She had also firebombed or threw a grenade, I think, into a cop car. She had been in a shootout with officers before. She'd been involved with violent robbery before, right? So and all of this was not only excused, she's now, there's all prizes named after her on college campuses. Bill Ayers has a department, right? He's considered an appropriate mentor to a political candidate who ends up being president like Barack Obama. And we're not even allowed to have a conversation about what that means, right? This is absolutely mainstream. I'm tired of being gaslit. It is absolutely mainstream for the left to endorse or at minimum turn a blind eye. And by that, I mean very directly, continue to promote these people, but just say mealy mouth exactly in the same way that they are with Jay Jones, right? Well, that was going a little too far, but it's, he's still the right candidate to be the top cop in Virginia. It never involves any kind of step back from actually endorsing these people who very explicitly either commit or endorse violence against their political opponents. Meanwhile, I don't know if anybody remembers all the way back to Todd Aiken. Okay, he got, blitzed by his entire party for making one stupid remark about rape and how women couldn't get pregnant from real rape or something very stupid. But that's all it was. It was stupid. It wasn't violent. It wasn't endorsing violence. And he got blitzed by his whole party, right? There is no comparison. There is no both sides. We've talked before about how the studies that purport, even from the Cato Institute, that report to say there's more right-wing violence, they're completely flawed methodologically. But even if they weren't, there's no comparison because this is mainstream and accepted by actual candidates for office, by actual leftist institutions. There is no Uncle Ted Prize in Hillsdale College, okay, for Ted Kaczynski. There's no endorsement of Ted Kaczynski in anywhere in Republican politics. It doesn't exist. And yet it exists every day in a completely banal way on the left.
Yeah,
That was a bit of a rant.
No, you're fine. This is something absolutely worth ranting about. It really is remarkable that the Democrats cannot stop wishing for the death of conservatives. You have to wonder if this isn't like the old metaphor, the old story about, you catch one of your employees stealing. Should you let them off the hook? And the answer is no, it's not the first time they stole. It's just the first time you caught them. I feel like this is what's actually happening with Democrats. It's the only reason that Mr. Jones got caught is because he texted all this to a Republican legislator. He didn't text it to his fellow Democrats. I got to wonder what is going on in Democratic group chats among elite politicians, especially, given the aftermath of Charlie Kirk. So many of them are comfortable expressing celebrations of his death in public. What are they doing in private? What are they thinking about in private? It's actually sort of insane. And it goes to show that, our politics isn't normal right now, when there has to be some reckoning on the left with this comfort with assassinations and the death, talking about the death of their political opponents. It's very, very bad for the country to let it even come close to continuing.
I think what we're seeing is un-American and anti-American, but it's where the left always ends up. And the Democrat Party is in hock to the left. It's dominated by the left. Even if they don't have the numbers, they have the sway and the power. And it's maybe wasn't initially a hostile takeover. It may not need to be a hostile takeover the way it's going, because they're already pretty much there at the end of the day. And I think this was a moment of clarity. The Democrat response to the messages coming out in this particular candidate speaks volumes, tells you everything you need to know. I don't think we should be at all surprised that they talk like this in private, because look at what's said in public: fascist, authoritarian, Nazi-esque, domestic terrorist, etc. When they use that language, of course, it suggests, well, what wouldn't you do to stop those people who are the most evil, deplorable people on earth? That is half the country that's relatively normie and common sense and just wants a nice, humble country like the one they grew up in. We should expect that this is what the kind of odious, disgusting stuff, abhorrent stuff that they say in private, it's akin to what they say in public. And the resorting to violence just illustrates that they clearly do not believe that they have won in the war of ideas, clearly not won in terms of dominance in our political institutions. They tried to censor the other side. They tried to criminalize the actions of the other side. And now they're trying to literally silence us through inflicting bodily harm and violence. That's what they do when they don't have total political power and total mind control over the American people. So the only justifiable response is to use every lever of power possible to disrupt and dismantle the networks that actually threaten law and order in this country and threaten violence against anyone who dares to dissent from their sick and twisted ideology. For the political figures who say these things and who are the mouthpieces and who whitewash the movement, you may not be able to get them on black letter of the law incitement. That's a very hard thing to prove. Obviously, if they're fundraising and raising bail funds for these types of people, a la Kamala Harris, they're certainly a there potentially. But minimally, I mean, they should be shunned and met with contempt broadly by the public. And that requires exposing their words and their odious deeds and their associated policies. But again, beyond that, I go back to disrupt and dismantle the networks using the laws that are on the books. And there's a national security memorandum that this administration has put out that does exactly that, builds upon the Antifa terrorist designation, which happened recently, builds upon the FBI severing ties with the likes of the SPLC and the ADL. But there is a strategy, there is a memorandum in place to use all the levers of the federal government to target the networks behind left-wing political violence. And that needs to be done with substantial vigor in accordance with the law. But post haste, I mean, immediately, with the full surging of federal resources that can be brought to bear. And oh, by the way, states are getting involved with this as well, including the state of Texas, where I think Ken Paxton just pledged to do just that.
All right. And with that, we'll turn it back over to me. Ha ha ha. Funny. Oh, I get to talk now. All right. So we're talking about the National Guard and what's going on in Portland and Chicago. So if you haven't been paying attention to the news, it's, one way to think about what's happening is that we have a straightforward rebellion of the state of Oregon and the state of Chicago against federal authorities. You have, on the one hand, both around one particular ICE facility in Portland, a complete unwillingness to enforce the law by local Portland police. And as a result, over the past months, there's been kind of sustained low-level violence happening, an attempt to resist cars driving through the road, some assaults on police officers. And even if you read some of the latest briefing in the litigation in Oregon, attempts to burn down the ICE facility, and plenty of people arrested on this front. And then in Chicago, you've got a whole slew of weird problems. You have, on the one hand, at the state level, again, the same refusal to cooperate. Mayor Brandon Johnson announcing that he's creating anti-ICE zones so he can, quote, rein in the federal government, as though he completely never read the Constitution once in his entire life and has no idea what the supremacy clause is. And then beyond that, there's the behavior by activists there who've been sieging effectively the Broadview facility of ICE, including a representative or a House candidate, Kat Abu Ghazaleh, who's recorded herself twice physically obstructing an ICE vehicle. You have, and then there's also the stories, like obviously there was the big shooting in Dallas a few weeks back, but there was an attempted ramming by a slew of these Antifa activists. And so all of these things combined mean that there's just this, both at the state level and among these people, there's just this massive pushback against ICE enforcing normal immigration law. And then, so Trump is trying to send in the National Guard, and also these authorities are trying to stop that, saying, "How dare you send the military to occupy our cities?" Well, the key thing is it's not a military occupation to occupy our cities. Instead, it's to protect federal facilities. One thing that I think has been missing a lot is that there actually aren't that many people who work in the enforcement arm protecting these federal facilities. There are only like 1,000 people in the entire Federal Protective Service. To the extent that there are these constant daily riots in places like Portland and Chicago, there's an enormous drain on federal resources. And those people are working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, working flat out. And the National Guard is just there to like ease up some of the protection required so that those people can not only get some sleep, but they can focus their efforts on law enforcement rather than the actual physical protection of the facility. And so this is just about the ability of the federal government to protect itself. Now, there's a district judge in Oregon that issued an injunction. I think that's doomed for this world, but it's still remarkable that there's just this concept that these states don't have an obligation to allow the federal government to enforce its law. We learned this lesson during Reconstruction, and the way that Jay Pritzker is talking about it could have been straight out of the mouths of Oral Faubus when, he was mad that Eisenhower was going to send the 82nd Airborne to Little Rock. It could have come right out of the mouths of the southern state governors during Reconstruction, who are furious about the federal government imposing their will. But we settled this question in the 1860s. The federal government is supreme. States have to obey the federal government where things are happening within federal jurisdiction. So with that, I'll wonder what you guys have to say about all this.
I'll just add on to that distinction. I perhaps unpopularly on the right, I actually defend the right of states to be sanctuary states. Because the definition of sanctuary states, cities, whatever, is about directing their own police, right? They can direct their own employees to do whatever they want. What they can't do is interfere with federal law enforcement. And I want to point out that that's what they're doing here, and it truly is a Confederate argument. They're saying that that federal law enforcement has no right to come in and enforce federal law in the boundaries of their state. That actually literally is a Confederate argument. And it has nothing, it goes way beyond, I should say, the actual federalism and the balance of powers between the states and the federal government. And I want to point out one more inconsistency here between the position of the federal government under Biden with regard to the plenary power over immigration and the position of blue states now. Under Biden, they said that the plenary power, and they argued in court, the plenary power over immigration of the federal government is so complete that it crowds out any state action whatsoever, even if that state action was completely concurrent and consistent with federal law. So they told Texas, you can't put barbed wire on even though that's what federal law says to stop illegal immigrants from coming across the border. It's completely consistent with federal law, and it was done with state resources, right? So you have both state and the federal government officially acting in the same direction, and the federal government coming in and saying, no, our power is so complete, it's so plenary, it pushes out any action on this issue by the states, right? Even if that action agrees with what the law is on paper. Now, the position of blue states is the plenary power of the federal government to enforce immigration law is so weak that they can't even protect their own officers enforcing the law within the boundaries of a blue state. That is a radical position. It goes well beyond state power or federalism or any conception of state power, as Will said, since before the Civil War.
Yeah, and it was incredible to watch people like Hillary Clinton use the concept of states' rights and federalism in such a bad faith manner against the right. Like, oh, well, I thought conservatives believed in states' rights. I thought you believed in leaving decisions to states. Well, not when it comes to federal law enforcement, of which immigration is the primary or rather that the federal government has the only authority over immigration. So you don't have a state right to impede those law enforcement officers. And in one of the cases in Chicago, when the ICE officials were rammed by this individual with the AR-15, they apparently had called the Chicago PD and they refused to actually come help them. So this is way beyond, we're not going to cooperate with ICE. This is, we are actually going to make their jobs infinitely harder. We are going to impede them. We are going to allow riots against their ability to enforce their laws. It's absolutely insane. And I brought up this point earlier today as well, but if you have Democrats who say, well, we're fine with deporting violent criminals, we just don't want mass deportation, we don't want to get rid of farm workers or people crowding outside of Home Depots or whatever. And like, fine, we can have that argument. I vehemently disagree. I think every illegal immigrant should go back. But if you actually believe that violent criminals should go home and and oppose ICE basically doing raids or going in with the National Guard assistance to carry out deportations, you are actually creating the conditions that they have to do that because your police will not detain people for any longer than necessary in order to allow ICE to get in and deport them from the prison. Like, ICE has to go into communities and serve warrants because y'all won't let them pick up the violent criminals at the jail. So if this is a problem to you, the supposed militarization of the federal police and the National Guard, you've caused that by not cooperating.
Yeah, and basically what we're saying is that the local police aren't defending the citizens. They're effectively defending the gangbangers under this policy. And really what this is it's a new nullification crisis brought by the same Democrat Party that instantiated the old nullification crisis. And yeah, of course, it's totally in bad faith. This has nothing to do with quote unquote states' rights, etc. This is about flouting an administration, and it's about subverting and sabotaging federal law enforcement activities. There are definitely legal violations that are happening right here. And I think you could probably see prosecutions against many of the public officials who are engaged in these policies. You can't harbor illegal aliens in place, and there's a slew of other related laws as well on the books here to the extent the Justice Department wants to get creative or not that creative, at minimum to deter this kind of activity. The other aspect of this, beyond kind of the hypocrisy at play and the compare and contrast of the two administrations, where under Biden, you have the feds that are derelict, that are step into the breach, and they are not allowed to do so. But here you have the feds being active, and they're actually being hampered and obstructed by state and local authorities. The other aspect, of course, is going to be the courts. And we're going to have an analogous fight probably in the courts. And I'm sure you're going to have insane rulings from district court judges in blue jurisdictions when it comes to, it's clear that the president has the power to do X, Y, Z with respect to immigration. But does the judge get to determine whether the conditions are sufficiently met, or is it up to the president to determine, and then the legislative branch, if the legislative branch differs, to impose all sorts of roadblocks, up to and including potentially impeachment and removal? And once again, I think we're going to see judicial supremacy and activism to the nth degree here at play. And once again, it's going to be the American citizens that suffer the consequences of it.
All right. Finally, we'll send it over to Inez.
So another development in Trump's, in this case, I wanted to say war against the universities, but in this case, it's really an olive branch and corresponding meltdowns in the university sector over what is an olive branch being offered to them by the Trump administration. There were a number of leaks in the last week concerning a compact for academic excellence in higher education. It's an offer being extended to at least nine universities, and they're carefully selected universities. So this is not a general offer. This is to particular universities. Those universities include UPenn, UVA, University of Arizona, University of Texas at Austin, a few others. Notably, I think, absent any of the big Ivy League schools. Brown is on this list, but Harvard, Columbia, Yale, all off of it. MIT is on. but if I would to characterize this, I would characterize them as high quality, actually state or public universities. I do think that that is notable. It's not exclusive. There are a couple exceptions to that. But I do think this is notable. This is aimed at essentially the tier just under the Ivy League. And what it is an invitation for priority processing as well as additional funding, largely through overheads, right? The federal government has the ability to cap overheads. The Trump administration has been cracking down on that. It went from about 8% in extra costs above a grant, right, for implementation, administration, et cetera, back in the 50s to 60% when the Trump administration came into office, right? So you would get 60% of the money that you applied for as a grant, like on top of that money for quote unquote administration. And of course, a lot of that was used for DEI nonsense and so on, but it also just padded the pockets of universities. So there's the offer for basically not having your funding threatened by the law enforcement actions under the Civil Rights Act by the Trump administration, plus some additional overhead funding that the Trump administration has discretion to play with. And the offer is essentially this: if you will voluntarily agree to this compact, and I'll go through some of the terms in a moment, then you can have this priority processing and actually have your access to federal funds unimpeded by the Trump administration. Some of those elements are a cap on foreign students at 15%, which is very generous, actually, but still something that a lot of universities can't meet. A 5-year tuition freeze. We all know that tuition has been skyrocketing well above inflation. It's a huge cost problem for a lot of families in America. So this is tying to a tuition freeze for 5 years. They are required to actually look at admissions tests. Doesn't specifically require the SAT. It could be, and I hope that schools will turn to the CLT and other tests, because I think the SAT is a completely garbage test at this point. But it requires some admissions tests, right? There had been a move during COVID away from any kind of standardized testing to a completely holistic admission system that was obviously open to manipulation, mostly for affirmative action or DEI purposes. This also explicitly bans admissions preferences based on race and sex. It ties these schools to the federal definition of sex and gender, meaning that they can't play monkey business with Title IX. And and this is the language that I would honestly strengthen. I think this is a compact that was mostly drawn up before what happened to Charlie in Utah, but it's quote, foster a marketplace of ideas and debate on campus and protect conservatives who want to introduce, and I'm paraphrasing here, but the language is pretty soft around protection of conservative speakers and conservative ideas. Require asking the universities to provide some balance among their staff, for example, and when it comes to politics. All of these are good ideas. I think this probably needs to be tightened up in light of what happened to Charlie. I think universities need to be explicitly forced to bear the cost of security of conservative events, because otherwise we've already seen recently an October 7th event just yesterday, which did go forward after pressure, but initially being yanked by NYU for security purposes, saying the security costs would be too high to hold this event, right? So I think that language probably needs to be tightened up if I were in the administration. Nevertheless, these are good principles for schools to adhere to. A lot of what is in it, they're actually required to do by federal law. For example, not discriminate on the basis of race. This is something that the federal government under Trump has been prosecuting them appropriately for, and it's why they've gotten big settlements from Harvard, Yale, and Columbia on that basis. So they're on very solid legal ground. They're only asking universities, for the most part, to agree to what their obligations that they already have under federal law. But nevertheless, it's an affirmative agreement with the Trump administration that is going to save the Trump administration the time and effort of prosecuting them, and is going to get a lot of what conservatives want. And I think what would really direct us towards a better future in the higher ed sector. I said in the beginning, this is aimed at that tier right under the Ivy League schools. I think this is essentially an attempt to extend an opportunity to some of these schools. I noticed that U of Texas in particular statement about being offered the compact that they made to media. They didn't say they would accept yet, but they said they were honored to be asked to enter into this compact. I think a lot of universities, especially those big, well-regarded public universities, especially in places like Texas and Virginia, that are not quite as crazy as the Northeast, they're going to have to see it as an opportunity. They're going to have the opportunity to leapfrog the Ivy League in terms of, for example, research grants. And that is going to affect their standing in places like the US World News Report. It's going to affect their ability to hire the best minds in math and science, right? So this is actually, I think, a very smart move from the policy wonks in the White House. I think it'll save ultimately a lot of litigation, a lot of overturning ridiculous lower court judges by having to constantly appeal to the appeals court or then to the Supreme Court. And potentially invests a certain tier of universities in becoming the next excellent tier of American, higher education that actually offers a free market of ideas on campus, sort of open debate and pursuit of the truth, offers the rigors of academic excellence. There's also a bullet point about great inflation in this compact. So real rigors of academic excellence. It's really giving them an opportunity to act like the universities that Americans should be able to expect them to be, ones that celebrate academic excellence and student performance, that are fair on the basis of race and sex and ideology, and that actually pursue the truth without fear or additional sort of strictures. That's the mildest word I can put on campus debate over contemporary politics. So I hope there are at least some universities that accept this offer. There's huge meltdowns going on. With that, I'll turn it over to the group.
I think this is great. I think it's really smart to offer a carrot and not just a stick to the universities. You got to give them something to actually want, give them more of a reason or a stake in what we're trying to accomplish. So I think it's a good idea. For some reason, I doubt they'll take us up on it. I just think that their idea of the idea that they would voluntarily cooperate with the Trump administration is just probably beyond the pale for them, but it's worth a shot. And I think it would be a good thing if they were willing to do this. And it's worth spending money to get people to behave the way you want. I think that there's a fundamental conservative reluctance to do that more generally, but I think it can be worth investing the money to actually create new partnerships, even if historically universities have been a serious adversary.
And the things that the Trump administration is asking for are so basic and common sense that they're not just good for the right, they really are good for the universities too, and will help restore some of the trust and credibility that they have lost in the previous decades. And there's been a lot of moaning about this from Democrats. I believe Gavin Newsom actually suggested that he would pull state funding from any California universities that sign on to the compact. And the reality is that every administration lays out requirements for universities to get federal funding, right? Like if Biden had succeeded in rewriting Title IX and universities didn't comply, they would risk their federal funding. That's how this whole thing works. If you don't want to abide by certain guidelines, especially in this case, very common sense, obvious guidelines, then the solution is just to not accept any federal funding. Like you can become Hillsdale, that's an option for you. But it's not beyond the pale or an abuse of power to say you have to abide by certain criteria in order to get taxpayer grant money.
Yeah, bottom line, I think if you want special privilege, there being certain strings attached to it makes total sense when it comes to your dealings with the federal government. And beyond that, these are not points that should be controversial in any way, and that they are. I mean, yes, you have the universities who are going to have kind of the boilerplate response of how dare you infringe upon our academic anti-freedom, really is what it actually is. But our academic freedom, well, you can go and be independent and do what you want, but you're not going to get the benefits of taxpayer largesse and all of the other sorts of goodies that you were able to receive to the extent you comport with the principles that the administration is going to lay out. And you might have to deal with litigation as well. And that is the hammer, of course, that is essential. And I think that to that end, Inez might be right. That might be the real inducement at the end of the day, is avoid the costs of litigation and the PR stuff and just sign on to an accord that's very basic and straightforward, but obviously is radical, I guess, by the standards of the administrators in our purportedly elite institutions. All that said, I'd also echo the concerns about the assassin's veto, as some have called it, on college campuses. Basically leveraging the assassination of Charlie Kirk to then silence any speech that the powers that be on campuses don't like is a huge concern. And I think it's going to be something that government power is going to have to be brought to bear ultimately to ensure that the silencing of Charlie Kirk isn't used to silence anyone and everyone that campuses disfavor. So that's one point that I think is worth echoing. And then beyond that, I think this serves as a useful model a useful heuristic by which to judge universities. And I do wonder if you're going to have some universities tout actually that they are acting in accordance with these principles, and you'll see how others completely flout them. So I think that also it's valuable as a messaging tool as well, and as a tool by which to grade our schools, to look at the criteria that are laid out here and see how, to what extent most schools are failing them and failing them miserably.
All right. With that, it is time for final thoughts. I'll kick us off. Hassan Piker, the Twitch streamer, was live streaming yesterday when he apparently decided to use his shock collar to shock his dog. You might say, why is this newsworthy? Well, the guy's like one of the biggest Twitch streamers in the world, a deep radical leftist, probably a guy who inspired Tyler Robinson, the shooter of Charlie Kirk, and just a generally horrible human being. He's had Houthis on his podcast. He's expressed support for Hezbollah. He's just actually a communist is a good way to think about it. But, he's been streaming to his followers, and he has his dog that he just wants to stay in one place. And the moment the dog got up just to come closer to him, you can see him reaching over his screen. And then a moment later, you see the dog yelp and just jump into the air in pain. I think this is actually going to be the end of him, because nobody can tolerate this. I realize there's almost no real areas of bipartisan agreement anymore. I mean, we talked just now about the problem of political violence and the general lack of sympathy for that. But if there's one area of bipartisan agreement, it's that it's not okay to mess with dogs and cats. I think literally everybody across the spectrum would agree with that. And so Hassan Piker, being fundamentally Turkish in outlook and culture, doesn't get that, because obviously the Arab world does not have the same attitude that the Western world does towards domesticated pets, and is willing to zap his dog with a shock collar because he wouldn't stay exactly in the place he wanted to be perfectly placed on his screen. And so if he ends up losing his channel, good riddance. Terrible guy.
Yeah, what I found out from this whole episode, by the way, is that he streams every day for like 7 or 8 hours. He spends his entire life streaming. I mean, we're all practitioners of the new media here, but that just, I wonder how that warps your brain, to be honest. Like, I find that even doing an hour or 2 a day really changes how I think, and I have to counteract it by reading longer form and whatever. I really that was a shocking little tidbit. Maybe that's a boomer moment on my part. But that just really shocked me almost as much as the dog thing. My final thought is sort of 2 pieces of the same puzzle here. One, yesterday, of course, on October 7th, we saw mass celebrations in New York City, just discussing parades. I wouldn't call them even protests. I would call them celebrations. This is something we're used to seeing in the Arab world every time, even completely innocent civilians, children, women, old people are slaughtered in Israel. There are celebrations, handing out of sweets and so on. Very much makes you feel like New York City is on the road to being like London. They have, look, believe me, there's no shortage of pro-Palestine protests in New York City. They could have knocked it off for a day, but instead it was even bigger and even more celebration. I can't say that word, but even more obviously happy about that attack and the over 1,200 people who died and people who were taken hostage. So just a really revealing, I think, moment for the quote unquote pro-Palestine protesters. Many of whom, by the way, I'm fairly certain do not have American citizenship, and who should probably no longer be welcomed by the United States, considering how much overlap there is between this kind of sentiment and also thinking of America as the great Satan, which is actually the point of my second piece of this. Chris Rufo has a great blog post up on this, essentially critiquing the pro-Israel movement from a PR perspective, from a messaging perspective. And I think those critiques are really, really well taken. That it is too focused on essentially carving out various exceptions for the Jews, whether that's domestically, DEI style attempts to create kind of boards of anti-Semitism on college campuses have been a total failure anyway, by the way. But just the rhetoric around that. And he has some critiques when it comes to foreign policy as well. He said basically that the arguments have relied on what are essentially boomer assumptions when it comes to foreign policy about the very, very close relationship between the US and Israel. And I think that's right. As somebody who supports Israel, I think that's correct. And his solutions are the right ones, I think, which is to make this argument on the basis of American interest, of national interest. He thinks that there's a good argument to be made. So do I, that Israel has been a good ally to the United States, that it's certainly much more reliable than our European partners in terms of taking care of its own business in its own regional part of the world, right? And I think that case can be made really strongly on those terms. I just would add one thing to what Rufo said, which is it seems like the entire debate, at least on my timeline among people that I know, is all moralizing about the war itself. And of course, that's particularly ridiculous to me from the anti-Israel side because a lot of the time they're talking about how they're like hard-headed, realpolitik type people, but they're not talking about the pros and cons of American investment or interest in the Middle East and how that does or doesn't dovetail with Israel's geopolitical interests, right? They're talking about it in Wilsonian moralistic terms. Oh, like this is a bad war, and not only is that based on the majority of it just complete nonsense propaganda from Hamas, it's also just not a realist perspective at all. So it's particularly ridiculous from people who claims to be America first, but I don't like it from either side, honestly. I think it is time for us to have a very open discussion about whether or not it's in America's interest to have such a close relationship with Israel. To me, the answer is clearly yes, but I think I would like to see more people make the argument on that basis. I know Ben does that really well. Will does that really well. So this is not a critique at this podcast, but I would like to see more of that in the debate around Israel and less about the moralizing of either side. I think that it would be beneficial to the large number of Americans, an increasing number of Americans who are genuinely on the fence, not because they think that Israel is not in the moral right or that because they, like the marchers yesterday in New York City, endorsed the attacks on October 7th, right? Or think that they're in any way okay, but simply because they would like it not to be their business or they're not sure that it is our business, right? And I think that that's a good faith position. It should be met in a good faith way. And I think that we are not currently doing, by we, I mean people who are for this U.S.-Israel relationship are not currently meeting those people in a good faith way as much as we could be. So Chris Rufo, always good critiques, always has a good sort of map on politics. So I recommend people read it.
My final thoughts are to provide an update on the Palisade fire just really quickly. They arrested a suspect for arson in starting that fire. This individual was an Uber driver who was apparently listening to French songs that talked about fires and creating chat GPT images of cities on fire as people in poverty were like running away from the fire. Really just disturbing stuff. He was like an avowed communist, apparently, according to the court documents I've seen so far. But I think it's also important to note that this does not absolve of responsibility California leadership in allowing this to spread. Apparently, they had tried to put out the fire that he set initially, but it basically stayed in the underbrush and eventually spread later on, causing, and then the winds, of course, took it and created this massive, deadly and destructive fire. So if California would actually take care of their lands, do controlled burns, and keep water on hand, then we wouldn't have had this problem, even if there is a crazy communist arson setting fires in the woods.
Two disparate points. One, just building on my segment, the positive news that I was remiss in noting is that the FBI squad, it was called CR-15, or the Federal Public Corruption and Government Fraud Unit, ironically, that was surveilling the comms of these senators and members of the House, has now been disbanded. I noted Timothy Thibault. He's an anti-Trump former FBI figure who was one of the leaders in that squad behind Arctic Frost. Something else that Chairman Grassley's committee revealed was this March 2017 email where basically internally at the FBI, word was getting around that they were looking at probing Trump for something pertaining to, it seems like based upon this email that was disclosed, issues around potential election law breaking. And Timothy Thibault has an email, which has now been released to a colleague, I think in the FBI, where he says, basically, we haven't opened an investigation, a case into the Trump campaign. And I'll quote directly from this email again. This is from March 2017. What we are doing, aggressively seeking out open source information, so human intelligence, info that could predicate a case. In other words, we are engaging in a fishing expedition to try and find some reason to open up a case against Trump. I mean, they were barely even hiding it in their own internal communications that this was a show me the man and I'll show you the crime kind of FBI in March of 2017. So a remarkable disclosure, and God knows how many other emails there are and texts there are floating around between people at the FBI at this time, where they were saying things just like this. Just incredibly disturbing stuff there. Separately, since Inez talked about October 7th and the second anniversary of October 7th just passed, I would note in reflecting that it was remarkable in the immediate wake of October 7th that it was an accelerant to the Jew hatred across the West, not just in the Islamic world, but across the West, which is always a proxy ultimately for hatred of the Judeo-Christian West. October 7th, you would have thought would have put the Jew haters and haters of America and the West to shame. And instead, this was actually an open invitation to be very overt in their views and to see those views frankly normalized and legitimized across Western institutions. Maybe not so surprising in Europe, given that you've had mass Islamic immigration and with it, massive shift towards the Islamic supremacist position among the governments where these are now their constituents. But remarkable to see, of course, and disturbing to see, but though not surprising here in the US. But by the same token, in addition to the tragedy that occurred on October 7th, and then the information warfare that the left primarily and the Islamic supremacists have been waging here to try and advance their material position, on the other hand, you could say that the Middle East is in far better shape than it's been in decades because the head of the snake in terms of Islamic terrorism, Iran, has not been decapitated, but something close to it. And its tentacles have been decapitated too, with the exception probably to a degree of Hamas. And we'll see ultimately what the resolution is there. So on the one hand, in real and material terms, you've seen the global jihadist movement eviscerated and decimated in many respects. And that's to the benefit not just of Israel, but it's to the benefit of America because they want us destroyed as well. And they have sought to destroy us. And there were Americans who were killed and taken hostage on October 7th as well. But the material and the real world, in terms of hard power, the balance of power has shifted substantially for defenders of Western civilization, our allies and partners. But on the other hand, what October 7th revealed was that ideologically and in our own minds in the West, to say nothing of the immigration-related issues, we lack moral clarity, and there is a real sickness and a real cancer that is metastasizing for all to see, and something we grapple with in our social media feeds, if not in real life, every single day. So it's sort of the best of times and the worst of times in some ways, and I'm sure these are going to be trends that we continue to talk about in the weeks ahead.
All right. With that, I think that'll wrap it up for this week. On behalf of Ben, Amber, and Inez, thanks for tuning in. I'm Will Chamberlain, and we'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.